Good morning, church family, and happy Sabbath. Um, Sorry I couldn't be there in person today, but I am healing up and I'm looking forward to being able to worship with you in the flesh soon. I thank you for all the prayers. They are being heard and they are helping. Also for all the food. That helps too. Thank you. Um, so I want to talk to you this week about identity. That's been something that's been on my mind a lot lately. It was sort of brought up because I was talking to my brother and one of my best friends. The three of us often played video games together as a way of staying in connection with each other. My brother's still in Florida. My buddy, his name is Bo, is in Texas, and I'm up here. It's funny, we were talking the other day. We talk online and we have like a little group text thread too. And it's funny to me because thinking about identity, we met Bo while my brother was recuperating from his accident after his surgeries and his amputation. He was in bed a lot, and one of the ways that he and I bonded was through video games, and we jumped online and met a big group of guys that way playing a video game, and made a lot of good friendships that way. But it's funny because in talking to us, Bo refers to us by our screen names, our video game names. Even to his wife, when he'll be talking to her. I remember one time he used my real name in conversation with her, and she's like, "Who's that?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I meant squared. Um, my screen name is sh squared. My brother's screen name is Cryptmaster because he's legless. It's hilarious. And but it's funny because like you're gonna be thinking like that's how he knows us, right? Is through those avatars, those screen names. It kind of made me wonder, what does our name say about who we are? My brother's kind of like that too, just in terms of like, I can tell how long somebody has known my brother based on how they address him. All right. If somebody comes and greets us and he says, "Oh, hey, John," to my brother's name is Jonathan. His full name is Jonathan David. But if somebody comes and says to my brother, "Hey, John," right away I know you've not known him that long. At best, you might have known him 10 years, but you met him after he graduated high school for sure. Most likely when he went to college. You definitely haven't known him a long time. Because anybody who's known my brother for any length of time, especially if you grew up with him, JD. You might hear Jonathan in its length if my mother is mad at him. But aside from that, it's JD. And it sounds odd. It sounds strange to hear anybody call him anything else because that is his identity, right? That's just how we've come to know him. And I think identity is something that people struggle with in our society today. There's so much wrapped up in names. People hear certain names and certain images spring to mind, and identities and reputations precede people based on name. And I don't know, it was just really intriguing to me. And so I kind of wondered what scripture had to say about our names, our identities, how that fed into it. And the story that I was led to can be found in the book of Genesis. So I'd invite you to turn there. We're going to be looking at Genesis beginning in chapter 32, but I want to kind of set the stage because the story really begins in Genesis 25. We're dealing with Jacob, specifically. Jacob and Esau. They're sort of wrapped up together, right? Because that's how they came out, wrapped up together, twins. And Esau was born first, a redhead, firstborn. I kind of identify with him a little bit. And then Jacob comes out holding on to his brother's heel. And so his parents look at that and they're like, "Oh, that's perfect. We'll name him Jacob," because it literally means someone who grabs the heel of another. And I don't know if they intended to do it, but it worked out this way, I think providentially. Jacob also can be translated as he who deceives. And that really became a defining characteristic of Jacob's identity. That's how he was known, as a bit of a deceiver. And for a time, maybe it didn't cause a whole lot of problems, but ultimately, that identity would be the catalyst for all kinds of crazy drama in his life. He ends up deceiving his father so that he can steal his brother's birthright. His brother, He gets so mad at him that he wants to murder him, which means that he has to run away and leave his entire family behind, but the identity follows him. He goes to a foreign land, finds extended family. He's deceived as a result of it, trying to marry his true love. He marries the sister, and so that deception sort of put back on him. He experiences it from the other end. And that identity of deception sort of stays with him throughout all his dealings with his family. Even when he's leaving, there's idols being hidden and bad blood and all this stuff, and it just becomes this defining characteristic of who Jacob is. And where we pick up in Genesis 32 is that definition, that identity is catching up to him, because he has finally left this manipulative family that he has been with, and he is returning home. And it's on the surface a vastly different person, because he initially, when he left home, he had nothing but the clothes on his back and a stick in his hand to beat off the wolves and the threats. And he's returning as one of the richest people in the region with 2 massive camps, one with a huge family and one for all the servants to deal with that family, and cattle and livestock and riches and wealth. But he's not returning in a joyous mood. He's not returning saying, I am a different person. He's returning scared because he's still that same person. And he's worried that that identity is going to catch up with him, and he's going to have to deal with the consequences of it. Specifically, he's worried about his brother, Esau. Because Esau's heard he's coming back. And he knows that when Esau hears the name Jacob, all the old feelings, all the old drama is going to be kindled. And he's worried that it might cost him significantly, not just monetarily. It might cost him his family. Esau's a violent man with a violent reputation himself. It might cost him his own life. And so we pick up chapter 32 with Jacob wrestling with his identity, but also wrestling with his relationship with God. Because, see, he ran away kind of knowing who God was, but not really embracing who God was. He heard about him from his grandfather and his father, but stories, not personal. And he sort of tried connecting with him over the years. He had seen God fulfill his promise to his grandfather and father, even in the way that he was blessed. And so he kind of knew he was sort of lumped in with them, and God was extending mercy to him because of who his family was. But I don't think he really felt like he had an established relationship with him. And so he's sort of wrestling with that too, because he's wondering, I got to deal with my brother, and I don't know how God plays into that and all this. And I want to reach out to God for help with all this because I'm desperate, but I don't know if he'll listen to me. So that's sort of where we find him coming back in. And we're going to pick up in verse 1. Jacob went on his way. The angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. So he called the name of the place Mahanaim. And it's interesting because he knows enough about God and who he is that even though his relationship is not strong, maybe not personal, he still can recognize people who have been in God's presence. He still recognizes his messengers. There's enough of a recognition there of God's identity too to say, oh, those people are clearly from God, so God is in this place. And I think that was a way of God knocking on the door to his heart to draw him closer to him in this time of desperation. So Jacob's like, okay, God's here, so maybe there's some safety here. We'll stay here. And he sets up camp. It says in verse 3, Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir in the country of Edom, and he instructed them, thus shall you say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban, his uncle, family, and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants and female servants. I have sent to tell you, my lord, in order that I may find favor in your sight. And so that's how the fear was manifesting itself. He's like, okay, he's probably still mad at me. He might even want to kill me. Maybe I can appeal to his better nature. Maybe I can appeal to his pride a little bit. I wronged him and took some things from him. Maybe I can shower him with gifts, and that'll sort of like soothe the savage beast. And so he sends all these gifts to him in the hope that maybe that'll like grease the wheel and make things a little bit peaceful. But he's still worried. He's still scared because the messengers come back and they tell him, we came to your brother Esau, and we want to let you know he's coming to meet you. And there are 400 men with him. And the implication is that Esau sort of dismissed the gifts, didn't really care, and he's coming to inflict harm on his brother Jacob. And it gets Jacob thinking. It says in verse 7, he was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people who were with him and the flocks and the herds into two camps, thinking if Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, maybe the other camp that's left can escape. Like, he's worst case scenarioing the situation. He's like, oh, okay, maybe all of us won't die because of who I am. Maybe I can save some of my people because of who I am. I'll send some of them away, and maybe there's a little bit of hope. But he's desperate. I don't think he has a lot of hope because he knows who he is and what his identity means to Esau, and I think he's scared and desperate. And in that desperation, he turns to the God that his grandfather and father told him about, the God that he sort of interacted with but never made it personal. And he says in verse 9, O God of my father, Abraham, and God of my father, Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant, who with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So we see in that desperation a recognition of who he is, a recognition of his identity, right? His name is following him. But he also knows God's name follows him too, right? He's this God that my grandfather and father told me about, and I've even seen a little bit of the mercy that you've shown me because of maybe my association with them. But now it's not about them. It's about you and me, and I'm desperate and I'm scared. And I'm uncertain, but I do remember this promise, and he quotes it back to God, right? That surely you will do good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea. He remembers this promise, and he says, I believe that you are who I've heard you are, but I'm wrestling with it. I'm struggling with it. Please show me. But you're all I got at this moment. And so he stays there that night with his family. He divides the two camps, still wrestling with the idea of what'll happen. I mean, knowing his brother, the likelihood is if he doesn't come with his 400 men to annihilate him right that moment, he might be so impatient he might even send assassins to come after him. He's worried. And so in the middle of the night, he gets up. We're going to jump ahead to verse 22. And that same night he arose, he took his 2 wives, his female servants, his 11 children. He crossed the ford of the Jabbok, the creek there that they were camped at. And he took them, he sent them across the stream and everything else he had. And it says in verse 24 that Jacob was left alone. He was doing everything he can to make sure that his name, his reputation, his identity wouldn't negatively impact the people that he loved and cared about. That they wouldn't be held accountable for his mistakes and who he was. And he's willing to sort of accept his fate alone, whatever that means. And in that state of desperation and isolation now, in verse 24, as Jacob was left alone, it says, a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And the man said, let me go, for the day has broken. It's interesting, Jacob's response. Because again, Jacob, I think at the start of this whole incident is probably thinking, oh, this is the assassin come to it. And so this is not like a play for wrestling. This is not something, oh, I'll establish dominance or this is a ritual thing. No, this is life or death for him. The desperation is real. He is fighting for his life, clawing, scratching, tooth and nail. There's no way he's letting go, because if he gives this guy even a tiniest opening, he knows he's just done, because he doesn't really know who this guy is. But it's interesting when the man says this, and he puts his hip out of socket, and Jacob's probably thinking, okay, this is it. He's going to get the death blow, but I'm not letting go. I'm desperate here. I'm clinging to any hope that just something will happen to show mercy or something, And so when the man says to let him go, he senses like an opening, and he says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And here's where I love how the story takes the turn here. The man says to him, what is your name? And Jacob has to confront his identity. He has to confront who he is. And I mean, he's a deceiver, right? That's what his name means. He could give a false name. He could use this as an opportunity to be like, oh, you got the wrong guy. Maybe for the first time in his life, though, he's honest, even with himself. And he just simply answers with the truth. Jacob. The man says, take note of this, your name shall no longer be called Jacob. Right? You're no longer going to be known as the deceiver, he says. But now you will be called Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. I looked up the meaning of Israel, and it can be kind of translated a couple ways. It's a combination of Yisra, which is Hebrew for he fights or he rules, and El, which is God. One of the many names that they called God in Hebrew. So his name, the man is saying, is you will no longer be known as the deceiver, but now you will be known as somebody who fights with God or rules with God. And I think if he had just left it at that, there still would have been that uncertainty with Israel now, because okay, somebody who fights with God and men, yeah, that's my life. It's chaos, it's conflict, it's constant fighting. But the man gives him the deeper context and says the reason that your name is being changed, the reason that your identity is being changed, the reason that you are now different is because you have striven, you have wrestled, literally wrestled. You have fought with God and men, yes, but you have prevailed. And that draws the context to the translation that I think his mind wouldn't have necessarily gone to, the idea that he not only fights with God, but that he rules with God, right? He's prevailed. Because to rule with God implies that you are now a member of the royal family, the ruling family. You are a member of God's family. And I think it sparks in in Israel's mind, an understanding of who exactly he'd been wrestling with. This wasn't just a messenger. This wasn't just an assassin. Somebody with the authority to make that proclamation, somebody with the authority to transform him, change his whole identity, to give him a new life. I think it started to dawn on him, the identity, but he's still wrestling with that uncertainty, right? And so Israel responds, well, it still says Jacob in the text. Jacob responds, please tell me your name. And the man says, why is it that you ask my name? And then he blesses them, blesses him, and leaves. And I love that response because he doesn't come outright and say it, but it's a very God thing to do, to answer a question with a question. It's done throughout Scripture. We see Jesus do it a whole lot. Because it sort of forces you to answer your own question. And I think when the man asked him, why do you ask my name? That Israel knew the reason he was asking is because he was starting to understand that he had been in the presence of God, that he was fighting with God himself. And by answering his own question, by being honest, he knew. Why do you ask my name? Because he knew that Israel had recognized his character, his presence, the love and the compassion shown him, even in the way he dealt with him. Like he recognized who he was, Israel was, as this, when he looked at himself as Jacob, this deceitful person, this unworthy person. And he knew that to be in the presence of God in that state meant that God would be justified to destroy him. He was sinful, and sin shouldn't exist in the presence of God, and so he knew that God had every right to blot him out. And that his life, his mistakes, his identity dictated that he deserved no mercy, no love. And yet he had been shown mercy and love. And so I think that that Israel sees in this answer, and being forced to sort of answer himself, the reality that not only this man's identity, that he'd been wrestling with God, but also the realization that it was a personal interaction, that this was not the God of his father or his grandfather, this was his God. That when you encounter and experience God in a personal way, that you are transformed, that you don't leave the same way that you came in. because that's what God's love does. It's transformative. So he's blessed there. And Jacob, recognizing all this, names the place to reflect these realizations. He named the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The chapter here finishes by saying that the sun rose him as he passed that place, limping because of his hip. When the man dislocated it, that was not just a passing thing to end the fight. That was something that would follow Jacob for the rest of his life. It was a very physical reminder of this transformation, this whole process. Physical reminder of encountering God. And it was passed on to his descendants, not just through his name, because they became known as the children of Israel. And even now to this day, the church, Scripture calls God's people Israel. We reflect what's embodied in this struggle and this transformation here. But they even remembered it because of that physical thing. They kind of focused on that. And it says in verse 32 that to this day, the people of Israel don't eat the sinew of the thigh on the hip socket because it's a reminder that God threw Jacob's hip out of place. And I think for a lot of people that it's that physical thing that they might focus on and remember, right? It's a great intro to a story. Why do you have that limp? Oh, let me tell you how I got that limp. But I think for Israel, it was the name. Peniel, for I have seen God face to face and my life has been delivered. He gave it a place that reflected the nature of his relationship with God had changed. He had wrestled with God and been delivered. He had been shown mercy and love. He had been given salvation. He had been transformed. He was no longer Jacob the deceiver. Now he was Israel, somebody who not only wrestled with God, but now rules with God. He had prevailed. And I was really drawn to this story, like I said, thinking about identity, because I identify with Jacob so much. I identify with feeling unworthy, feeling like my mistakes are going to catch up with me, feeling like I can't exist in the presence of God sometimes because I'm just so drenched in sin and so filthy. And I feel like I fight with God a lot. I feel like I wrestle with him a lot. Even though I've seen the fulfillment of his promises, I've seen how faithful he is and how compassionate he is and how consistent his love and mercy are. I still wrestle in times with uncertainty, and I feel like I should know better, and I struggle. I feel like I'm wrestling with God himself to be like, don't let me go until I see the blessing. And it can be painful sometimes. But even if it is, even if it is a desperate struggle and it is painful, I'm reminded in this story that God does not let me go. And God doesn't let me remain in that place. He doesn't force me to struggle and fight from now until the end of time. He provides a way out. He provides salvation. He provides transformation. And he shows me, like he did here, that my identity is not in who I was or how other people know me, but my identity is wrapped up in who he is. He's given me a new name. I don't know what it is yet. I might have to wait until we get to the kingdom to find out. But it's the reality that I am not my actions. I am not my mistakes. I am his child. I am loved. I am forgiven. I am enough. Even when I don't see it in my own eyes, but to Jesus, I am enough. I'm worth it. So much so that he was willing to come and hang on that cross and experience the weight of every sin ever made, even if it meant I would still say no. I'm enough. Because my identity is in him as my creator. I am his child. And so this story gives me hope because it lets me know that even when I do feel like I'm wrestling with God, I know my identity is not in me, it's in him. which means that I will come away, as Israel did, a new person. I will come away blessed. I still might come away with a limp. I still might come away dealing with the consequences of some of those mistakes, but with the assurance that I don't fight with God, I rule with God. I am a member of his family. I have been accepted. I have been redeemed. I have been forgiven. And I want to encourage you with that, because the same holds true for you. As you experience God's love, even if you're wrestling with him right now, understand that you will come away from this transformed. That's what God's love does. It doesn't leave you the way that it finds you. And that transformation is evidence that you are worth it to God. And in a society that seeks to define you by your achievements or your mistakes, by your relationships, whether it's romantic or professional or just friends, whatever, like this codependency, who you're connected with, left, right, blue, red, all these things that we try to use to define us. Understand that what defines you is your Creator. You are a child of the King. You are a member of his family. If you choose to accept it, you are redeemed. You are forgiven. You are transformed. You are Israel. You fought with God, but now we have the promise that we will rule with God. We have the assurance that that promise will be fulfilled when Jesus comes again, and soon. So I hope this gives you hope. I hope this lets you know how loved you are. I hope this gives you inspiration to not let go, to boldly seek God's blessing, even in the midst of trials and struggles as you wrestle with all these things, to cling to him because he is your identity, he is your salvation, he is your transformation. He's your King. And he loves you. Happy Sabbath, church family. I'll talk with you soon. Bye.